We go back to the beginning. And this is a very useful verse in the Dhammapada I always use. Whenever anyone who is new to Buddhism asks you, what did the Buddha teach? Can you summarize briefly what did the Buddha teach? Or in fact, anyone from other religion trying to ask you, what is the teaching of the Buddha? Of course, it's going to be very lengthy, confusing, and difficult to explain to them the Four Noble Truths, to explain to them the Eightfold Path. All that is a very long process. But this Dhammapada verse number 183 beautifully summarizes in simple ways the teaching of the Buddha. The first verse, basically there are 3 points. The first point is abandon all evil ways. The second point, enter the good life. And the third, purify one's mind. And this is the teaching of the Buddhas. Notice that the Buddha is in plural because that's really what it is meant to be. When Gautama Buddha was explaining this, he was referring to his own learning from all the Buddhas before him. So that's why this word Buddha is in plural. All the Buddhas basically taught these 3 things. Now many of you may have come across a slightly different translation of this. One of the most common, in fact the most common, the first line, it is called avoid evil. The second line, it is called do good. I'm going to point out to you why this translation differs from the others, and I would safely say this is a more precise translation. And in fact, this is the translation of my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji. Many of the presentation I'm going to show you today with the English translation that may differ from what you traditionally find in common Buddhist books. Most of those translations that are different, they came from my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji. Now, what's the difference between avoid evil and abandon all evil ways? When you have defiled thoughts arising, when you have instincts that arise and disturb you and cause you to do unwholesome things, the arising of these unwholesome thoughts, you cannot avoid the arising. So you really cannot avoid the arising of unwholesome conditions and unwholesome states that already are inside you. Right? Avoiding these unwholesome states that are already inside you, that process is called pahana. Now, you can't avoid it, but what can you do? It arises and it causes you to want to do something unwholesome. And when you realize that, and understanding the Buddha Dharma, you realize it is unwholesome. Therefore, you do not allow yourself to subscribe to it. You do not indulge in it. So that is abandoning, because they arise, they cause you to want to do something unwholesome. You realize it, then you don't go ahead with it, you don't do it. Then this is abandoning. Give up the negative thoughts, give up the unwholesome thoughts, let it be, let it go. That is abandoning all evil ways. To say avoid evil, that is not so precise. So this is a more precise way. I'm not saying that avoid evil is incorrect, but this is a more precise explanation, because many of these evil thoughts and unwholesome thoughts, they were already conditioned into us. And when they arise, we can't avoid the arising, but we can prevent ourselves from behaving in accordance with what it tries to make us do. The second one, commonly translated as do good. Now, how does do good differ from enter the good life? Enter the good life is actually talking about your whole life. Do good is just an effort, just something you do from time to time. But the Buddha wasn't teaching people how to do good from time to time. The Buddha was teaching people how to transform their lives. And transforming your life is a matter of entering the good life. And the ultimate in entering the good life is what all of you are now doing, to participate in renunciation, the process of renunciation. And the third one, of course, is quite commonly translated the same way, purify one's mind. But I would like to stress also, I've seen quite commonly, a lot of people try to purify other people's mind. They don't learn to purify their own mind. So here what the Buddha really meant is purify one's own mind. And this is the teaching of all the Buddhas. This is really a summary of what the Buddha Dharma is all about. And that takes me to this word Dharma. Very often the word Dharma has been translated to the word truth. It sounds good, it sounds right, but actually the real meaning of Dharma in Pali, and also Dharma spelled with R in Sanskrit, it actually means experience. What did the Buddha teach? The Buddha was not teaching the truth. The Buddha was teaching his own experience, how he had experienced life and how he had become awakened from it. And that is what he was teaching, the way to awakening. So this is really a very simple way of describing and summarizing what the Buddha taught. We go back to the beginning when he was a prince, indulging in sensual pleasures in his palace, surrounded by young people, beautiful people, strong and healthy people, and good food, smiling people. He never sees much suffering and always experiencing so-called happiness from sensual pleasures. And then he realized that something must be wrong somewhere. So he started to explore what's going on outside, in the outside world. So he, from time to time, sneaked out of the palace and went out to see what goes on. And he came across 4 great signs. An old man. Then he realized, I could get old one day. People do get old. Aging is natural. And then he came across a sick man. Then he also realized, people do get sick. People can get sick. And it is not always easily avoided. And then he came across a dead corpse. And he also realized, people do die. Eventually I too will die. And then he came across a renunciate, a monk. And he started asking the monk, what are you doing? And the monk basically explained that he was renouncing worldly pleasures and going into his own practice. And in those days, most monks were practicing asceticism. So he thought that was a good idea. So he recognized that these are very important realizations since the beginning of civilization. The biggest problem that humans are trying to solve is really this issue of the problem of existence. And what is the problem of existence? Birth, aging, sickness, and death. It goes on and on and on. So that is a problem to be solved. And then he felt that he needed to do that, so he decided to leave the comfort and the security of the palace and go in search of a humanistic solution. Humanistic meaning he cultivate himself to practice whatever he can learn and do it himself to discover the realities of life. It's not a godly solution. Many religions would be using godly solutions. God created this, God made that. Whatever happens to you, it's because of God's will. But he realized that it's not the way to be. That humans are capable of doing something with their own lives, with their own surrounding, and changing the world in their own little ways. So that was what he went out to search for. And he started practicing after learning from some teachers that he was not satisfied with, because both the teachers he learned from, they were neither arahants, they were not enlightened beings. And he realized that in his own understanding. And then he realized he had to find a solution, and together with 5 friends, he started practicing asceticism by self-torment and self-mortification. And he realized that was not the solution. He stopped eating, he stopped drinking, and finally when he tried to stop breathing, that's when he fainted, and that's when he nearly died. But he was saved from there, he recovered. Then he realized he had to practice in his own way. And then he finally found the way to practice his own cultivation under the Bodhi tree. Actually, it was a fig tree in those days. It was not called the Bodhi tree. And then he attained enlightenment or awakening. And he was called the Buddha. As many of you know, the word Buddha came from the root word Bodh, which means to awaken. So he was the Buddha, the awakened one. And the fig tree, they renamed it the Bodhi tree. It was never called the Bodhi tree. It was after he became awakened, it was called the Bodhi tree. And in fact, this was found in a small little section at the back of a small town called Gaya in India. And that's why they renamed that town Bodh Gaya, for the same reason. Then he started to give his first sermon to his 5 ascetic friends. And that first sermon was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, setting into motion the wheel of Dharma. And in that sermon, he pointed out that there are 2 extremities to be avoided. What are the 2? The first is basically sensual pleasures. When we get emotionally excited, we begin to react to it. We begin to do something about it, indulging in these sensual pleasures. So this was the first extremity to be avoided. And then he pointed out this is indulgence in pleasures. Right? Pleasure indulgence. Then he says there is a second extreme to be avoided also. And this is from his own experience. The first one, pleasure indulgence, came from his experience as a prince. So he was really talking about his experience. He wasn't talking about this arbitrary truth. He was talking about his experience. And the second was also his experience with his ascetic friends. Self-mortification, self-torment. When we become aroused, when the emotion is aroused, we suppress it, we control it, we withhold it, and absolutely do not react to it in any way. And that can actually cause a lot of pain and suffering. So he again pointed out that is also to be avoided, because that is an effort to restrain yourself, forcing yourself. It's like tying a dog to a pole, refusing to allow the dog to move and run around. And the dog will be suffering. In the same way, if we do that to our body, we hold everything, then we would be suffering. And he was speaking from his experience. Then he pointed out that there is a middle way. Now, one of the common misunderstandings of the middle way is that they think that most people, well, I'm referring mostly to lay people, they think that the middle way is, well, a little bit of pleasures now and again, and a little bit of restraint now and again, then I'm practicing the middle way. No, that is not the middle way. That is called compromise. To do a little bit of indulgence and a little bit of restraint, that is compromise. The real middle way is a third way. What is the third way? And the Buddha pointed out, when things are happening around us, all these changing vicissitudes of life, conditions are changing, and then our emotions get aroused. What should we do? We should learn to relax. Conscious relaxation. And he calls this conscious relaxation samatha. So the practice of cultivation of samatha is basically the cultivation of relaxation. Relaxing the body and calming the mind. And bring the attention inwards. Introspective attention. And the comprehensive practice of this introspective attention is satipatthana. And finally, you will then experience mental equilibrium. The mind can be stilled. And the stilling of the mind is samadhi. So basically that's what he taught. And then he explained there is a way to do this. And that way is the sublime eightfold way. What most people come to know as the Noble Eightfold Path. And that is basically what people should be practicing and cultivating. Right? So then he went on to explain to those 5 ascetic friends that there is these 4 noble truths. And of course he pointed out that there is suffering, And there is the origin of suffering, there is an end to suffering, and there is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And we're going to take a look at suffering then. Right? We're going to look at suffering from a scientific perspective. So suffering, dukkha, often translated as suffering, dissatisfactoriness, and here I'm pointing out it is stress, the physical suffering, and distress, the mental suffering. So what is stress? And how does it arise? What can we do about it? So the first noble truth that talked about what is dukkha, the Buddha pointed out, of course, birth, aging, illness, death is suffering. But he then went on to explain separation from what we have already experienced to be pleasurable, that is suffering. To be with what we know is going to be unpleasant or painful, that is suffering. And to want something, to desire something, to wish for something and never get it, that is suffering. So these are the three additional main aspects of suffering that he was explaining. And then, most importantly, the 5 aggregates that arise whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything. If we begin to attach our mind to it, we begin to cling on to it, we begin to pay attention and do things about it, clinging on, that is suffering. So basically this is the first noble truth, what is suffering. Now, to be separated from what is pleasurable, we know something to be pleasurable when we have experienced it. So it is basically coming from our memory. So when we realize that there was something from our memory that was pleasurable and we are no longer having it, we regret that this pleasurable experience from the past has all come to an end. So we are very unhappy about it. And that is dukkha. And then, to be with something unpleasant. Of course, when we know something to be unpleasant and we see it arising, and then we begin to imagine that it's gonna stay there, it's gonna hurt me all the time. That is fearful of this painful experience will come back and continue. That is imagination. And then we realize there's some desires we wish for that we haven't got yet, but we somehow are not getting it. That is expectation. Dissatisfied with our desires that are not being fulfilled. And finally, clinging on to sensual experience and indulging in it. This is basically personalizing it, holding on to it, personalizing this experience and thinking that there is a self that is being affected by this experience, this feeling. And this is basically the result of ignorance and delusion. So this is really the first noble truth of suffering. So we're going to take a look at the suffering and the causes of suffering from a scientific aspect. When we allow our memory, imagination, and expectation to disturb our mind, this is what happens. Human beings are the only species in the world that regrets the past, is fearful of the future, and is never satisfied with the present moment. So this is suffering. Our life is continuously filled with suffering because we regret wonderful things that we have experienced. In fact, even painful experiences in the past, we also regret. What do we regret? We regret that we have ever experienced the pain. It should not have come into my life. Even though it's over, we still regret that it has ever happened. This is why when somebody hurts us and it is all over, we don't forgive people. We think about it and then we hurt ourselves just thinking about it. That's why we regret the past. And then we think things could happen again in the future. Good things that we wish for are not going to come anymore. And painful things that we don't want, they might appear in our life. And that we become fearful of. And then we look around us, we are never grateful with all our blessings. Looking around, we are unhappy with things that are not perfectly the way we want them. Then we become dissatisfied with the present. So this is what happens when we allow imagination, memory, and expectation to disturb our mind. So the second noble truth is talking about the causes of suffering, the origin of suffering, where the Buddha pointed out that it is craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight, lust, and then seeking pleasures here and there in order to overcome the difficulties and the pain, and craving for these pleasures, and craving for getting rid of things that we don't want, and craving for things that we want to remain forever. So those are the three kinds of craving. The first kind of craving refers to lobha, lust and greed for pleasures. Actually, lobha begins as lust, something we desire, something we experienced in the past that is pleasurable. Now we want it. Wanting it is lust. So we lust for it and we begin to get it. But very often, whatever we get is never enough. Then we want more and more and more. So lust turns into greed. The second one is unpleasant experiences, pain. We want to get rid of it. We want to avoid it. So it begins as aversion, to avoid unpleasant experiences. But we can't always avoid unpleasant things in our life. They stay with us sometimes, for quite a long time even. One of the simplest example is that you may have a relative, a brother, a sister, a cousin, or an uncle living with you or is in close proximity with you, who's always giving you trouble, causing you a lot of unhappiness and suffering. Can you get rid of him? Well, he's your brother, he's your sister. Worse still, he might even be your mother and your father. So you can't always get rid of these conditions that are hurting you in one way or another. So aversion turns into hatred, because if it continues, if you can't avoid it and it continues, you hate it. So aversion turns into hatred towards these pleasures. And then we have this delusion that there is a self that is being affected by feelings. So this delusion is really a delusion of self-centered existence, thinking that this self can be healthy always, thinking that this self will never age. How I wish my hair will never fall off. How I wish my hair will never turn white. How I wish I will never get sick. So this is a delusion that there is a self being affected by these feelings. Delusion of self-centered existence. Now, I want to point out, according to my teacher, and he has explained it very perfectly well, the word tanha, often translated as craving. A more precise scientific explanation of the meaning of tanha is our emotional reaction. We react to these stimulations from the environment. That is tanha, the reaction. So tanha, if we were to look at it more precisely from a scientific perspective, the real meaning of tanha is emotional reaction. And the Buddha pointed out very clearly, emotions is everything if we are not careful. Emotions dominate the world. People behaving in strange ways because they are led by their emotions. Emotions create distress. Here it is mental suffering. So emotions create mental suffering. Emotion is the one thing to which all are spellbound. So when emotions arise and emotions begin to disturb the mind and we begin to react to emotions, then we are controlled by emotions, spellbound. That leads to more severe suffering. So what is emotion then? And how does it arise? So the Buddha pointed out, emotion is really part of a mental experience. Now, very often we talk about the word mind, right? M-I-N-D. When we ask people, where is your mind? Where do most people point to? They point up here. But what are they pointing to? This is not your mind. This is just the brain. It's just an organ. And it is the activity of that organ combined with the activity of the central nervous system and the body basically produces an experience. So we can only speak of experience. We can't talk about the mind as an object, that the mind is something that exists. So the correct or more precise way of comprehending what is mind is to recognize that mind is an experience. So the Buddha pointed out that there are three parts to this mental experience we commonly call mind. The first part is vijnana. Vijnana is referring to this process of perception that whenever our sense organ is being stimulated by the environment, a mental perception arises, a mental image arises. We have seen something, we have heard something, we have touched something, we have smelled something and tasted something. So all these are mental experiences. And this part of the mental experience where it arises because of our sense organ, that is called vijnana. That is what is being perceived by the sense organs. And the process that gives rise to this vijnana is the panchakanda, the five aggregates, or what is commonly called the five aggregates. So we have this perception, oh, I've seen something, I've heard something, I've touched something, and so on. The second word that the Buddha used to describe mental experience, now these are three parts, they are not three different things, they are all interacting, they are all happening at the same time. The second word that the Buddha used is mano. This is talking about the thinking part of the mind, the cognitive process, what scientists call cognitive process. Or to put it in a layman's term, it is our intellect, our rational thinking, our ability to think. And when we have this ability to think, then we always interpret what goes on. Every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, every time a perception arises, we begin to interpret, what is this? Why is this so? So we begin to give meaning to it. What arises in front of us, stimulating our sense organ, that is commonly called the rupa. And the meaning we give to it, that is called the nama. So that's why we have nama rupa. My teacher explained very clearly, rupa is not talking about that physical object. Rupa is talking about this reflection of this physical object, which is actually an image. We are not seeing an object, we are seeing an image of the object. So rupa is really referring to this image. I'll explain this a little bit further later on about rupa. But basically this second mental experience called mano is the thinking mind. And the Buddha pointed out that there is a third mental experience called citta. The scientists call this the affective process, or what lay people commonly call emotions. Now emotions is a big word. It means quite a more comprehensive thing, which we're going to talk about. I'll show you from a scientific perspective what is emotion and how does it arise. Basically, from this philosophical aspect, emotion is basically this reaction to pleasant and unpleasant experiences. Whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, that experience in itself carries a feeling of whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And when we begin to, and these pleasant and unpleasant experiences arouse the emotion. Arousing the emotion triggers emotional excitement. And then if we begin to react to it, that is emotion. We are acting emotionally. So we react to this. That is tanha, the reaction. So that is one part of it. The other part, whenever something happens, we think, oh, there is a self being affected by this feeling. So we begin to cling on to this experience. We personalize it. This is me. Simple example, you wake up in the morning and you knock your hand against the wall. Of course, it's painful and it hurts. What do you say? In your mind, what do you think? Do you think, this hand hurts? Nobody thinks that. What do you think? My hand hurts. My. What have you done? You have personalized that experience. Every experience. You see your friend. Do you say, these eyes see that person? No. I see him. See, you've personalized that experience. Every experience you have, you personalize it. And this is, of course, happening in untrained minds. And hopefully this is what we're going to do during this process, to train our mind to realize that this personalization is going on. And if we continue to allow this personalization to go on, it will lead to our suffering. So that is really it. We personalize every experience. And there is this notion, as a result of this personalization, there is a self. And we're going to take a look at that. You'll be amazed that science can explain this very well. Amazing. Science can explain anatta beautifully. And I'm going to show it to you. So let's take a look at the process of experience. How do we experience? The first is environmental activities. They stimulate our sense organs. We have 5 physiological sense organs. And this stimulation of sense organs gives rise to a process called panchakanda. The 5 aggregates, continuously happening because our sense organ is being stimulated by activities in the environment. It goes on and on and on. It never stops. So we're going to take a look later on about this panchakanda using the sense of sight to explain from a scientific perspective. And when this environmental stimulation stimulates our sense organ, that means light entering the eye, sounds triggering vibrations in the ear, we hear something, we see something. So that produces a mental image, a perception that something has arisen. We have seen something, we have heard something, we have touched something. That's why we have this mental capacity, the ability to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Because we have sense organs that are being stimulated. If these sense organs don't work, then that sense is missing. A blind person with eyes that don't work then will not be seeing, and so on. So this is the first part of the mental experience, vijnana. My teacher calls this perception, more precisely. Vijnana is often translated as consciousness, but unfortunately consciousness is not a very good word to describe vijnana. It's really the perception, the idea that you have seen something, the concept that, oh, I have seen something, that is perception. So that's really what vijnana is about. It's not about the consciousness, because when you say consciousness, it refers to a whole lot of other things. A whole lot of other things, the ability to think, the ability to feel. But vijnana is not talking about the ability to think, nor the ability to feel, but simply the ability to perceive the environment. So it's really, consciousness is not a very useful way of understanding vijnana. Perception is better. The mind now produces a mental image. Oh, I have seen something. I've heard something. Oh, I touched something, and so on. That is perception. At the same time, another mental experience arises, mano. This is the cognitive process. The process of cognition. Cognition is referring to the ability to explain something you have just experienced, right? That means the thought arising in the mind. This is a bottle of mineral water. Oh, that is a computer. That is cognition. So that is mano. And then the third part of mental experience is chitta, the affective process. The affective process reacts to the feelings. Everything you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch comes with it, associated with a kind of feeling. If light is very bright, would that feeling be pleasant or unpleasant? Light that is very bright hurts the eyes, so that is unpleasant. Sounds that is very loud or screeching, high-pitched sound, squeaking away, that is very unpleasant, But we hear soft, mellow sound of a nice little drum. Boom. That is very soothing. So you got pleasant and unpleasant. If we see red light, that is unpleasant, because red light somehow arouses and irritates the central nervous system. But if we see green and blue light, we feel a bit more peaceful. Right? Pleasant, unpleasant experiences. Regardless of whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, it triggers a reaction in the body. And this is actually arousing this reaction in the body. So this is the physical part of tanha. The body reacts by releasing hormones, releasing enzymes, releasing various chemicals in the body. So there is a biochemical reaction going on. And this biochemical reaction causes certain parts of the body to behave differently. Some changes are taking place, and that is some kind of a tension in the body. It can cause your heart to beat fast, causing your breathing to deepen, causing your muscles to all tense up. All this is tension in the body. Tension in the body stresses us. Whatever condition that stresses us is called a stressor. So we're experiencing all kinds of stressors. And when this happens, we begin to feel these tensions in the body, bodily sensations. This is the physical part of suffering, that bodily feeling of something that is physically disturbing us, the physical disturbance, physiological disturbance. And this is what I call stress, the dukkha, the physical pain and physical suffering, dukkha. So this is the physical stress part of it. But emotions come in two dimensions. That means the two aspects of it, not just one. This is one, the physical part. So the first aspect of emotion is the physiological part, which is what I have just explained. The second is a psychological part, the mental part. Now when these bodily sensations, when we experience changes in the body and these bodily sensations come to disturb us, we become aware of it and arouses an emotional excitement. That is actually the psychological part, the mental experience. And where there is arousal, there is reaction. If we don't do anything about it, all arousals lead to a reaction. So, how does this, first we will take a look at the physical part. How does this physical part of suffering is manifested? You see, whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, the brain responds to it by triggering messages down our spinal cord. And this goes through what the scientists call sympathetic pathway, or the sympathetic nervous system, sending messages to various parts of the gland. And various parts of the gland begin to react. One of the glands that react is the adrenal gland. And it begins to release two very powerful hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And then what do these hormones do? They cause the heart to beat faster. They cause the blood pressure to rise. They cause you to breathe deeper, more rapidly. It stops your digestive system. It causes your muscle to all tense up, right? And it causes your hair to stand on end. Maybe you don't have this now, but it gives you a sensation called goosebumps, goose pimple. That is really the hair on your hands standing on ends. I guess you didn't shave your hands, so you will still be able to experience goosebumps. Even if you did shave it, the root is there, and you would still be experiencing goosebumps when it straightens up. So goosebumps, goose pimple, that is hair standing on end. Then your pupils dilate. That means the pupils open up in order to try to see more clearly. Because all this is a reaction to something that the brain perceives to be some kind of a threat. Because it's an instinctive reaction that has evolved over millions of years. So the pupils open up to try to see more clearly. Facial expressions get distorted. You can see when people are fearful, when people are anxious, when people are angry. Do they have calm face like us now? Or do they have this cringed up face, right? Facial expression distorted. And then we begin to perspire, tremble, body temperature rises, blood sugar increases because it has to convert stored energy to active energy in order to fight against the threat. And body immune system is suspended to allow us to do all these things. So this is the manifestation of physical suffering. It happens to all of us. To most of you, I can say one word and I can already trigger it in you. I say asam laksa. Many of you will feel sourness in your mouth. Or wasabi, you begin to feel a tingle in your nose. That is because of a biochemical reaction in your body causing that. The moment you hear the word, it arouses and triggers this reaction. We can't avoid it. It's always happening 24/7. While we are awake, even while we are asleep, this can happen to us when we see, hear, smell, taste, touch anything. And then it triggers the biochemical reaction. So when this biochemical reaction arises, this bodily sensation is being felt. It arouses the citta, and then the citta triggers the arising of memory, imagination, expectation. We can't control this. It happens. Every time we see something, we remember something associated with it. If we're not paying attention, we don't realize it. But if we pay attention, we realize that every time we see something, we remember something associated with it. And this remembering could be conscious or unconscious. Most of the time, it's happening unconsciously. And then, the mind begins to react to it. This mental reaction is because of citta. Memory, imagination, expectation arises, and if it is something pleasurable, we want more of it, lobha. If it is something unpleasant, we want to get rid of it, dosa. And then we have this delusion that the body, the self, is being affected by it. That is moha. So that is emotional excitement, which is an arousal that leads to mental proliferation. The mind begins to wander off, imagining things that are fearful and so on. Mental proliferation. And that disturbs the thinking mind. That emotional mind disturbs the thinking mind. So citta, with its memory, imagination, expectation, disturbs the calmness of the thinking mind. The mind cannot think rationally anymore. This disturbance is called distress, domanassa. Because the Buddha pointed out there are 5 parts of suffering: sokha, parideva, domanassa, dukkha, and upayasa. So this is really the mental suffering that is going on. So dukkha and domanassa, they go together. Dukkha is the physical suffering, domanassa is the mental suffering. So this is happening, causing us to do things and react to it as an organism. And this disturbance is really pulling the mind apart, tearing the mind in 2 directions. Because the thinking mind is figuring out something wholesome to do, something we should or should not do. But the emotional mind leads us in an emotional way to say, oh, if this is pleasurable, take more of it. If this is unpleasant, get rid of it. Well, some things are pleasurable, some things are unpleasant. Like learning the Buddha Dhamma and then practicing the Buddha Dhamma, where sometimes we just have to restrain ourselves from doing unwholesome things. We know something is unwholesome, or we know something is not healthy, and yet we want to eat more of it, we want to do more of it. So the wanting to do more, wanting to eat more, something pleasurable, that is because of the citta. But knowing it is not healthy for us, knowing it is not good for us, that knowing is the mano. And they are torn in different directions. Most of the time we use our emotions to make decisions. And if we're not careful, it could actually cause us even more suffering than what has arisen. And this is our own doing, self-affliction of mental suffering. And Buddha pointed out in another Dhammapada verse, whatever harm one enemy can do to another, whatever harm one hater can do to another, it is our own ill-directed emotions that inflict upon ourselves a greater harm. And this ill-directed emotion, the Buddha was referring to the mind proliferating, mental proliferation, running around because of imagination, memory, expectation. The mind begins to imagine things that are not real. It begins to be fearful of things that are already gone and never satisfied with things we cannot change in front of us. So this is really mental proliferation. It can actually cause us even more suffering. Now, one thing I want to point out, I mentioned to you, the thinking mind is mano, the emotional mind is citta. Very unfortunately, almost all the translations of the Pali Kenyan, from Pali into English, all the translators, they translate citta or mano with only one word, mind. They don't differentiate, almost all cases. So if you look at this particular verse, the common translation is that circle part is that ill-directed mind. But Buddha was not talking about mind. I checked the Pali version. The Buddha was referring to citta, the emotion. So it's your ill-directed emotion. not ill-directed, mind as a whole. The word mind is too big. It's talking about all the three kinds of mental experiences. So it's really talking about your chitta being ill-directed. That's leading to more suffering. And the same thing, you notice this word. If you may notice a different translation, which says, mind dominates the world, mind creates distress, mind is the one thing to which all are spellbound. But the Buddha was not talking about mind as a whole, because mind has three different mental experiences that are interacting. Buddha was talking about chitta. That's why this is more precisely translated as emotions. This is one of the wonderful teachings from my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, who pointed out very clearly that we have to differentiate and understand. So, if we don't understand that emotions can disturb us, and this is a very old ancient shloka. Shloka are philosophical poems used in ancient India, written in Sanskrit to teach people good morals and good virtues. This is commonly used to teach children not to behave like animals. So it says taking food, sleeping, avoiding dangers, sexual activities. These are acts common between animals and humans. Both animals and humans do those things. Eat, sleep, avoid danger, and reproduce. But this shloka pointed out, the ability to think is what makes humans different. Without thinking, humans are just like animals. That's why we are equipped with the ability to think. And that part of that ability, the Buddha says, is the mano. And the mano is the thinking mind. So using your mano to think can help you be a more human person, not behave like animals. This is why in Sanskrit, in Pali, in Bahasa Malaysia, and also in Sinhalese, the word for human is called manusia. It's the same. Bahasa Malaysia calls it manusia. Sanskrit and Pali calls it manusa. Right? And the same with Sinhalese. Why? Because some of the Bahasa Malaysia words, the old words were derived from Sanskrit, influenced by Sanskrit. They came from the root word, mano. That's why humans with the ability, endowed with the ability to think, are called manusia. Because we have mano. We are not called chittasya. Right? If we can only feel, and we would be chittasya. But we can think, so we are manusia, as different from animals. And again, the Buddha pointed out, it is this ability to think, and this is the most famous Dhammapada verse, the first verse, Manopubangama Dhamma. What was the Buddha referring to? Very often, you will see this translation that says, mind precedes all truth or all realities. Mind dominates and creates everything. It's not mind. Buddha was not just talking about mind again. What did the Buddha talk about? The Buddha was talking about mano, the thinking mind. The ability to use our mind to think can help us lead a better life. So, we have basically talked about dukkha. Now we talk about anicca. How anicca affects reality.